are going to install Active Directory, we're just going over the basics. And so if you don't know anything about Active Directory, just understand that it is a centralized option that Microsoft provides to manage users, computers, groups, printers, grant permissions, and just generally authenticate users to the network. And so what we are going to do today is we're going to start from Server Manager. And so before you go through any of the steps to install Active Directory, you will need to do two things. You will need to make sure it has a static IP address, and you will also need to make sure that you name it. Naming it after you install Active Directory and promote it to a domain controller is not a great idea. It can definitely cause some conflicts along the way, etc. All right, and so the first thing that we are going to do is we are going to name it. So if you go to a local server, right, your server should have a name. And so I've already named it. By default, what happens with Windows, Microsoft is you'll see a long drawn out name like WIN and other characters after that. The computer name should be no more than 15 characters. All right. And so because I'm working in a virtual environment, this is DHCP, but in a professional environment, in a real deal environment, you should have a static IP address assigned. All right, so let's get started with installing Active Directory. All right, I'm going to go back to the dashboard in Server Manager. You can click here, Add Roles and Features, or you can actually click Manage Add Roles and Features. It's up to you. You'll get to the same place. So Add Roles and Features, next, next, next. And the first thing that we have to do is we have to choose Active Directory Domain Services. In older versions of Windows Server, you were able to do a right-click start DC promo and boom. You would get the options to promote the domain controller and you would just go from there. Now it's a two-step process. So Active Directory Domain Services, click there. You want to make sure you include all the tools, add features, next, 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 and install. All right. And so while it's installing, you want to kind of think of your domain name if you don't have it, if you're just doing this for practice, or if you're in a professional environment, you want to already have this portion mapped out. So it's just taking a little bit, but it should be completed soon. And it could be just because it's being watched, but we'll see. All right, and it's done. And so there's an option to promote this server to a domain controller here or promote it through the notifications. I'm actually going to choose the notifications just so you can see. All right, and a domain controller, think of it as like the brains, the authoritative figure in the Active Directory environment. It's the server that's going to replicate the information and also authenticate the users based on their credentials. If their credentials aren't good, then they will not have access to the network resources. All right, and so I'm going to close this just like I mentioned a few seconds ago. And I'm going to click here and click promote this server to a domain controller. Whether we would have clicked it before closing the installation window or clicked it here, you're going to get the same thing. So promote this server to a domain controller. And then we get options. We get add a domain controller to an existing domain. We don't have an existing domain. Add a new domain to an existing forest. We don't have an existing forest. This is a fresh install. And so we are going to add a new forest. And so for the root domain, you want to make sure you use, so let's say your company has a website, abc.com. Internally, you do not want to, name your root domain abc.com, because what happens is this domain controller is going to be the DNS server. When internal users are trying to get outside to the abc.com site that's hosted externally, it will cause conflict. It will, hey, this website is not available, etc., because it's conflicting with abc.com from within and externally. And so if you had abc.com for your company for the domain for Active Directory, you may want to use something like abc.local. All right, for me, I'm going to use VM21 test.local. All right, and you'll see domain name server, DNS, and global catalog server. And so we're not going to make it a read-only domain controller, and especially with it being the first domain controller within this environment. So you have your forest functional levels. If you happen to have older servers within the environment, then you would choose accordingly for the forest functional level. But at this time, you should have at least 2016 within your environment. All right, and so for the directory restore, directory services restore mode password. So for this would be if you needed to recover your server, but in a case where you have domain controllers and multiple domain controllers, if one goes down, then you have another one to replicate the information. So it shouldn't be too much of a concern if you have multiple. So I'm going to set this. All right, and then we have this flag for DNS delegation. Don't worry about that at this point in time. We don't have an authoritative parent zone. The NetBIOS name will come up. You want to leave that as is. The NetBIOS name is how it's seen on the local area network, how it's seen. Next. All right, you want to leave these directories as is. Don't get fancy. Next, unless you know what you're doing. All right, and so it gives you a little preview of all your selections. You could also view the script and save it for later if you wanted to. Next. So it's going to validate the prereqs. If there are any issues whatsoever, they will pop up here. All right. All prereqs are good to go. And so we are going to start the install. So we'll go through everything. One thing that will happen at the end is it's going to let you know that it needs to reboot. You can reboot it yourself, or it is going to force a reboot. All right, and there we go.